Welcome to my session on the variation cache. I am Christian van den Ende. I work at Factorial. It's an agency from Hamburg. On Twitter, you can find me under Magentix, even though I really never use Twitter. But yeah, you can still find me there. I don't know. Sometimes I share my slides there, like just basic stuff, but I don't actively use it or read it. I'm the author and the maintainer of the group module. You may have heard of it or you may have used it. Since November last year, I'm also a maintainer for the subsystems in core, namely user and cache. Really having fun with that last one. Lots of bugs, but also lots of cool stuff to do. I'm a highly sensitive person. I always put that in my slides. It basically means that my body is oversensitive to everything like touch, smell. So I get dizzy, I hyperventilate. Sometimes I may need to take a break, or if I pass out, obviously come check on me, but usually it's not that bad, but still I mention it. Kind of like, it helps people who have the same thing, that someone is standing in front of them and showing them, you can still do things when you're highly sensitive. So yeah, our session agenda for today is, well, three parts really. We're gonna quickly discuss what the variation cache actually is, how you can use it, and then how it works internally. So the first and the second part are probably the most important to you, so that after today, you know that it exists and that you can use it and how you should use it. And the final part is because I promised a deep dive. So it's really just, what makes it tick internally. So, short introduction. What is the variation cache? Well, it's basically a cache with cache context support. So you may have already seen this in the past. It's the code on the right where you have render arrays and you have this hashtag cache thingy in it, and you specify context. And somehow, magically, that works. You say that, this render array varies per user, for instance, because you're showing the user's name. You put the user cache tag in there and it works. So it's essentially a cache that just knows how to deal with cache contexts. However, it's no longer only in render arrays. It used to be the case until about a year ago when VariationCache got accepted into core. I needed a similar functionality in group where I could vary stuff by cache contexts, and it wasn't available. And I looked at core how they did it in other places instead of the render cache. And they were basically just putting a lot of stuff in a render array and then pulling that through the renderer, saying, yeah, the render cache will take care of it. Not great. So I didn't want to do that. So I looked at the render cache in core. I abstracted everything out of it that basically requires cache context to work. And I put that in the variation cache. Name is quite self-explanatory. You can cache variations of a thing, hence variation cache. So now, it's more than just the render cache. It's actually used in core in multiple places. We have the render cache, obviously. We hollowed that out and we put it back in as a dependency. We have the dynamic page cache subscriber, which also needs to store the full requests based on certain cache contexts. The access policy processor, which is what you see on the left and how it uses the variation cache, but more on that in a second. And the resource object normalization cacher, and probably some other stuff like group uses it, flexible permissions use it, but these are the things in core. So that's basically what it is, but how do we use it? Well, before I'm going to show you some code and examples, I'm going to quickly go over the steps that you need to ask yourself whether or not you even want to use it, and what you need to be able to use it. So first of all, you need to determine your variability. And now it's really important that you pay attention to when I say variability and cacheability. At first, we only care about what it varies by. We don't care about cache tags, we don't care about cache keys, we don't care about max age, just what it varies by. So you have a render array is the easiest example, but in your own code, you have something that varies by something. Figure out what that is and see whether you have a cache context for it, because you'll need one. If you don't, you'll need to write one. So a few notes. Every step will have a few notes. If your cacheable thing does not vary, you do not need the variation cache. So if that's the case, you can just leave. Your life is perfect because you can use regular caches. But you're probably here because you want to figure out what to do when your stuff does vary by something. And you should always optimize your cache context, but more on that later in the deep dive. Step 2 is choose your cache. And this is quite easy. If you have something that doesn't vary much, let's say it varies by user roles, then there's not going to be that many variations. So you can just use the default caching core, which is a database cache, and be done with it. But if you have something that varies by a lot, or that might be altered by an outside process, which would add even more cache context, and then they multiply, then it's going to vary by a lot. So you'll probably want a dedicated cache. Essentially, a dedicated cache backend, very easy to declare in Drupal, but it creates a separate database table so that when you're looking for a cache entry of your specific thing, that it will only have to go over the entries for your specific thing and not everything else in the website. So keep that in mind. A couple pointers here. If you do declare a service for a custom cache backend, make sure that it's always prefixed with cache dot, because then the second part becomes the name of the cache bin. There is actually a bug in core where the book, well, no longer in core, where the book module did something wrong here, but that's now a standalone module, so whatever. It will be wrapped by the variation cache. So that's actually pretty clever. The variation cache isn't a cache. It's a wrapper around the regular cache. We call it the variation cache to make it obvious that it's still doing caching for you, but it's not a cache. It's just a wrapper that does some magic stuff with cache context and then talks to a regular cache that is fed into it. So that's why you need to pick a database cache or a null cache or a memory cache or whatever, because it works with every cache backend, and you just feed that into it. Then you need to collect your final cacheability, and here's the important difference. First I said variability, now I say cacheability. So after you've created your objects and you knew initially what it varied by, it could be that something else, and especially in the case of render arrays, added something to it that added an extra cache context. In render arrays, that bubbles up. Somewhere else, we'll see in a second how you collect that one. Somewhere else, it might be added by an outside process and added using a method or something. But essentially, at the end of your process, you may end up with more cache context than you started with. But you'll also end up with your cache tags, your max age, and everything that you need to send to the cache. That's why I call this the final cacheability, because we will require everything from that, not just the cache contexts. So a few notes here. Your final variability, the variability from the cacheability, so the cache context, are always a superset of your original ones. Makes sense. If originally something varies by, let's say, your permissions, and then someone adds a little piece that varies by user, it makes sense. Well, that would optimize, but still, it makes sense that it still varies by permissions. Or if it varies by the fact that you're on the front page, whatever you initially varied by should still always be the case. Otherwise, we cannot talk to the cache, because the cache will need to know that. Like when you stored it, it varied by something. OK, we'll need to try and retrieve that by that something. So if you end up with a final cacheability that has different cache context from the initial one, you'll get an exception, because that is simply not supported. If your code cannot be altered from the outside, your initial variability will be the same cache contexts that are in your final cacheability. That's a perfectly valid use case. You could have code where you say, you know, this varies by user roles, and I don't want anyone else to alter this from the outside. Then your initial cacheability is immediately the final cacheability, and then you can just use the same object there. And your best practice is that if you're not working with render arrays and you have something that you want to add cacheable metadata to, especially cache context, use the cacheable dependency trait, or better yet, the refinable cacheable dependency trait. That's a mouthful. To allow people to add cache context, cache tags, cacheable dependencies, etc., to your object. So what does that look like? Let's. Oh yeah, sorry. And finally, talking to the variation cache. So we're going to need all of this. So your initial variability, your eventual cacheability, and cache keys. Cache keys you probably know already. If you have a render array that you want to be cached, you specify in the hashtag cache some keys, which is a bunch of strings, and eventually that will get turned into a cache ID. Also happens for you, but and more on that later. But that's what happens there. So that's how you talk to the variation cache. I forgot to press play here, so I have no idea how long I've been talking for. That's quite sad. Variation cache only looks at cache contexts in the initial cacheable metadata. That's what I said. If we want to retrieve something, we only know what it initially varied by, so that's what we have to go on. But the final cacheability is used for storing stuff, so that we do tag it correctly, set a proper max age, etc. Okay, so let's talk more code. Okay, now I'm gonna give you an example. It's a pretty crappy example in my opinion, but it gets the job done. So let's assume that we have a service that finds people like you on the website. And in order to represent those people like you, we're having this value object. And this value object is simply, it's very dumbed down. It has a getter, but more essentially, it uses the refinable cacheable dependency traits and the interface so that you can add cache context to it, etc. So as I said before, the first step is, what does everything vary by? Well, in my example, we're going to find people like you based on your roles. So at the bottom, you'll see, populate by roles, which takes that value object. It gets your current user's roles, and then it does some stuff with it, which probably is really expensive, so that's why you want to cache it. Well, at the top, you can see that we instantiate this value object that we had, and we add the cache context user roles. That's your first step. Get your cache context in there. Your second step is to choose a cache. And as I said before, if it's really simple, you can use a default cache. How do you use the default cache? Well, you just instantiate a variation cache and you feed it the name of the cache backend. So in this case, that's default. So cache.default translates to that little thingy there, default. If you want to create your own cache, you can do so too. And that kind of looks like this. So we have cache people list, and this part is just basic Drupal code. That's not related to the variation cache at all. This is how you would declare a custom cache backend. And because we didn't specify anything after here, it's a database one. Otherwise, you would have to specify the backend like memory or null or whatever, but it's a database one. So this is essentially just a table in the database where you can store your cached items. And then your variation cache wraps around that. So I should have a slide that highlights these things. So you can see the second part of your cache service is the bin name, which you use for cache factory get, but also for variation cache factory get. Do keep in mind that this doesn't belong here, because as I said, the variation cache isn't an actual cache. It's a wrapper around the cache. So we don't want to declare this to Drupal as a proper cache bin. The proper cache bin is still the thing that you are wrapping around. It's really important. If you try to specify that on a variation cache, you're going to get all sorts of ugly errors. Then you just insert that into your service. So I have this people like you repository, and you inject that service. So that is like you would inject a cache service, you just inject a variation cache service. So that's all you need to do. I am racing through this, holy crap. But that's good because I'll have more time for the deep dive. So this is the code, and I'll quickly show one thing, highlight it, because it has all the code, and I don't want you to read that yet. So when I said collect your final cacheability, the cool thing that I mentioned earlier when you're using a refinable cacheable dependency trait is that your final object, your value object, is your final cacheability, because it contains all of that cacheability. You don't need to create a cacheable metadata object or something. They all implement the same interface, and the variation cache just looks for that cacheable dependency interface. So this is perfect. But let's look at all the other pieces. So talking to the variation cache. As I mentioned, you need your cache keys. They can be anything. You define them. Please prefix them with your module. Please don't create collisions because you don't do that. And then you'll notice that I'm no longer immediately instantiating a people object because it might be coming from the cache. So there's no need to instantiate that value object. That value object might be expensive. What's not expensive is a cacheable metadata object. So we instantiate that, and we add our cache context there. And now we go to the cache. And this is where you'll see where that initial variability comes into play. We specify our cache keys. We specify our initial variability. And the cache has all it needs to find whatever is currently represented by those cache contexts. So if you find that, just like a regular cache, you return the cache data. If you don't find it, that's where we create a people list, and we add the cacheable dependency of your initial cacheability. That's a shortcut, so you don't have to specify the cacheability again. And then you call populate by roles again, and now you want to talk to the cache. So you specify your cache keys again. You specify your initial cacheability again at the end, but in between, you're going to give it the data that you want to store, and you're going to give it the final cacheability. And now it knows how and where to store it, and it will put it in the right place, and it will be able to find it. If you don't have like a getter, like get people, this could be even shorter, and this could just be people list, because you would store the full value object in cache. That's also valid. You can do that. In my case, I use the getter because I'm just interested in an array of people. Is this clear so far? Or am I going way too fast because I have a tendency to do that? No? Okay, cool. This is the part that you needed to know, for instance, how to use it. Now I'll explain how it actually works. Before that, I am going to have a sip of water because I am suffering from a dry throat. Okay. Next. I said next. Okay. Next. Oh, I fucked it up. Oh, okay, it's back. Cool. Down the rabbit hole we go. So I'm going to take some more time for these slides. The first I wanted to race through, so I had more time to explain this, and I can imagine there will be many questions. So forgive me for my pace earlier, and hopefully this will be a bit better. So down the rabbit hole we go. So first of all, I mentioned that cache keys get converted into a cache ID, because a regular cache stores things with a cache ID. With a cache ID. So it's a string. How does that work? So let's assume that we have a cache context called user. And I said called user. And we have cache keys, my keys. Internally, and you may have seen this already in Drupal in the cache context manager, internally, that translates to this string. So for user 1, it's this. For user 2, it's this, and so on. If you add more cache context, then it translates into a longer string, obviously. But the gist is that every time we take the cache context name, we put some square brackets around it, and then we feed it the value that's coming from the cache context. This isn't exactly correct because it would be sorted alphabetically. So the last one would be first and the user would be last, but I thought it was prettier like this. So screw it. Now we need to talk about cache redirects. And I put this little background image in there because we're in Belgium and everyone probably already knows how good our construction works are going. So yeah, but the thing that powers the variation cache is a little beautiful thing actually called cache redirects. So let's assume this scenario. You have a dashboard. You can choose which dashboard you get. It's something that you set on your account. So there's this flag or a drop-down where you choose a dashboard. And we have some cool dashboards for you to look at. We have one about animals, about plants, about symbols. Did I really put, wow, that's generic. And space. Space is where it's at. So if we choose for the animal dashboard, nothing special happens. If we choose for, that would be a cache context called user dashboard type that would represent that because it's a property on the user. So you would prefix that with user. And then if we look at the dashboards, nothing special happens except for the space one. The space one actually shows an icon in the background of a sun when it's daytime or the moon when it's nighttime. Don't ask me why. It's probably prettier, but that's what we have. How would we cache this? Because we know that if my cache context returns dashboard type animal, then, oh, sorry, I'm moving. This is why I should be standing there, by the way. So sorry, just quickly recap. So again, the cache context for your, whether it's the sun or the moon would be time is day or something. I don't even think we have a time thingy in Drupal, so you could prefix that with whatever you want. But anyways, if you want to store this, these dashboards are simple. We basically, when we go to the variation cache with our initial cacheability, what's going to happen is we're going to create one of those strings that we saw before. It's in the bottom. It's called my cache keys user dashboard type equals animal. So we talk to the regular cache with this long ass string, and we find animal dashboards. And it's going to work the same for plants and symbols. But now it's daytime, and I'm going to show the sun. Can I store the sun in that little orange square on the right? I can't, because then my cache key would be user dashboard type equals space, and I'm showing the sun. So what happens if I need to eat some fruits? That's what you get when you're hypersensitive. You need to remind yourself to do stuff. Sorry about that. So really, life is like a robot. So anyways, so you're trying to store the sun in there, but that's not correct, because when it's nighttime, that's going to return the moon. And if we store the sun in there, then we're going to return the sun when it's nighttime, which is bad. So what we do instead is we store this little object there called a cache redirect. And that cache redirect is just a value object. It really is. That's all we're storing. And that value object can contain cache contexts. So it again has the cacheable dependency trait. And the variation cache is clever enough to ask itself that if it's getting something back from the cache and it's an instance of the cache redirect, that it will go to the cache again. So now it will say, okay, I knew the user dashboard type was space, but before I can find the actual item, what is the time of day? Is it daytime? Is it nighttime? And it combines those two to form a longer cache key, and it finds the sun. So it actually just goes to itself again, but with this longer string. So these strings get built incrementally. And now let's say you have a scenario where, if it's nighttime, you actually want to have the lunar phase. I'm like fully freewheeling. I might be showing the wrong slide again. No, I'm right. So if it's nighttime and we want to show the icon for the moon, we might want to show the new moon, the first quarter, full moon, and last quarter. And this is where I actually said that you want to optimize your cache context if you can. Because let's look at this. You have a regular database cache inside the variation cache. We already went to it once. Then we went to it twice. And we went to it again. That's 3 round trips to the database to find an icon. But essentially, are we doing something else here? Something different? No, we're just showing icons. So what is the difference between the sun and these lunar phases? They're all just icons that we can represent by looking at the time of day and perhaps the day of the month or whatever. So what if we created a cache context that gives us that value instead? And this is one of these optimizations that you can make. So we get rid of that and we make them siblings. And now you only need to go to the cache once for animal, plant, and symbols, but you only need to go a second time to the cache for everything else. You can only do this if you have full control. For instance, with render arrays, this is really difficult because anyone might be adding anything to your form or your page or whatever, and you don't know that. But if you have full control over this, if you programmed everything surrounding these dashboards, and you know this, please optimize your cache contexts. Every page, every time you have to load that dashboard, it's 1 round trip to the database viewer, and that adds up. Like if you do that in multiple places, it does add up. So this is one thing. Now, and this is the crazy part about the variation cache, self-healing. So up until now, we had the perfect scenario. We loaded our animals dashboards, and then we loaded our sun dashboard, and then we loaded our lunar phase dashboard, all in an order where we neatly follow the path downwards. So let's say, ideal scenario, first of all, I have the sun. What happens is when I load the sun, the variation cache sees that the sun was something that varied by time of day. So in this slot, I'm going to store a cache redirect for time of day. So now we have to follow that path again. We find the sun. And then the second time I tried to load something, it was nighttime. So now I have the new moon. And the variation cache is again clever enough to say, hey, I'm actually varying by time of day and the lunar phase. So the common denominator is the time of day. So I'm going to leave that as the cache redirect. And I'm just going to put another one behind it for the lunar phase. It's smart enough to do that. But this is the ideal scenario. What happens if we have an empty cache and we happen to load the new moon first? Now, variation cache, it doesn't know that the sun exists because the first thing it gets is the moon. It doesn't know that there's a sun icon yet. So now we have these 2 cache contexts in our cache redirect because the first item that we tried to store had the dashboard type, time of day, and the lunar phase, and variation cache is smart enough to find that the common denominator is the dashboard type, so it only takes the rest of that set, and it stores that as a cache redirect. If I now try to fetch the moon, the sun, what's going to happen? I'm going to ask the cache for the time of day and the lunar phase to see whether I can find the sun, which makes no sense whatsoever. Why would you ask for the lunar phase during daytime? No sense. It's still going to do that. It's not going to find something, and then it's going to ask Drupal to calculate the sun. And then when the sun is calculated, we take it to the cache. Now, at that point, a little something called self-healing happens, because the sun is only going to have time of day. Yet at this point, we have a cache redirect, which is too specific. So we're going to break the path. We're going to override that cache redirect with just time of day. Only that. Which means that we can no longer find the moon. That path is broken. So what needs to happen is next time it's nighttime and it's still the new moon, we're going to go to the cache. We're going to ask for the time of day. It's going to give us nighttime, and we won't find an object in the cache. So now we need to recalculate a new moon. And this is the only downside, but you can get lucky. More on that in a second. So this is the only downside. We'll have to recalculate something that is already in the cache at the right address. It's already there, but we can't find it anymore because we broke the path. Now, when we recalculate that, we will again get the optimal scenario where the new moon has the cache context for lunar phase, time of day, and dashboard type. And VariationCache will again be smart enough to see, okay, this is the common denominator, this isn't, so I'm going to put everything that isn't into its own redirect there. So we recalculate and restore that. Now, this is the worst case scenario. You're out of order, and you had to recalculate something that was already in the cache. In an optimal scenario, the self-healing would be better. Let's say that new moon was in the cache, and we could no longer find it. But first quarter is now active, and we're calculating that. The cool thing is that first quarter would equally be calculated and put this redirect there, meaning that the next time it's a new moon, we can still find the thing that we calculated all the way at the beginning, because that never had to be recalculated. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah? Okay. So that is self-healing in a nutshell. It's smart enough to see that something is overly specific, and then it will restore it. And with there's another type of self-healing where it will find common ancestors. So let's say at this point, we're not only interested in the lunar phase, but we also want to know a solar phase, if that even exists. Let's say it's an eclipse or not. So it wants to know whether there's a solar eclipse or not. So the first time we go there, it's going to create a redirect for solar phase, time is day, and dashboard type. And the second time, it's going to have to break that path, because this one will be time of day and solar phase. But it's going to see that this has lunar phase. So what it's going to do is it's going to take this, and it's going to say, okay, the common thing was still time is day. So I can definitely put that cache redirect at the top. But I know that the remainder is lunar phase. So I'm going to immediately store that here. So now there is a full path for everything that's lunar, and there is a broken path only over here. So next time you calculate something solar, the cache redirect for solar will be put in place, and we can find all the solar phases. That's how that works internally. So now if I press play again, there's going to be a slide that says, are there any questions, which is the next thing. I still can show you some of the code, by the way, if we have time left, which we probably do. First of all, are there any questions about this? Is everything clear how the VariationCache works? Oh, and I need to throw the die if there are any questions. So my goals for this session were to explain, what it was, how you use it, and how it works internally. Do you all know what a VariationCache is by now? Yes. Do you know how to use it? Yes. Did you like to figure out how it works internally? That will help, by the way, if you try to optimize things. That will help if you know how it works internally. Okay. Are there any questions about this? It's a very abstract thing, so I can imagine. Okay, there we have at least one. Again, no depth perception, so cool.
Do I have to switch it on, or is it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's on.
So you were saying it's abstract. So can you give a brief explanation of how you're using it for varying the permissions, which is the example I've come across it in?
Yes.
And just the idea of then being able to alter it after the fact that someone has made a set of permissions and adding a context onto it.
Yes.
Because it's kind of crazily powerful.
It's really powerful. I'm going to see if I can. I'm really shit at computers when it comes to stuff like this. I'm going to see if I can stop mirroring the display. How do I? Control, maybe. Come on. Wait. Hold Option while dragging the screen. Okay, I'm holding Option. There. Do you now? I have no idea. Uh, this is awkward. I'm trying to get. Ah, yes. Success. Cool. Okay, I'm gonna show something here. So this is the first piece that I wanted to show. I'll get to your question in a second. If you want to see how everything that I explained works internally in code, look for the class VariationCache in Drupal, obviously, and read it. I spend a lot of time documenting everything that I just said in the code. I think that's really important. That's something we're not doing enough in core and in Contrib. So I spend a lot of time here, and this explains all of that. And you can, for instance, here see that if there is a result and if it's an instance of cache redirect, that is that thing that I mentioned. It's simply a value object. The cache looks for that. That's how it works. Now, let's look at something cool. Access policy processor. So this is the part that uses a variation cache, and there's a lot going on in there. Again, documented, so you can read that. But let me show you an example. So before I show that example, actually, what is the access policy processor? Since Drupal 10.3, which is coming out soon, we now have access policies in core, also by yours truly. What that does is it hands out permissions based on any contextual value that you can imagine. So what we currently had in core was a system where user 1 was able to do everything, and users were able to do the things that they were allowed to do based on which roles they had. If you think about it, those two are actually access policies. If you're user 1, you get full access. If you're not, we check your roles and we get those permissions from them. So what we did was we turned those into access policies, and an access policy's job is basically to take any contextual value, current user is 1, or current user roles are blah, 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 and turn that into a list of permissions, just a list of strings. Now, with this new policy in policy API in core, you can define anything you want. It's currently office hours, so people are allowed to carry out work on the website. As soon as it's after, let's say, 5 p.m., all of their permissions are revoked. We don't want them to work on the website outside of office hours. That's one thing. No CEO ever is going to do that because they're all, capitalistic pigs, so to speak. But you could have that in an ideal world. So that would be an access policy. And that access policy would be based on a cache context, time of day, or time dot is office hours, or whatever you want to name it, right? So this is where the variation cache really shines, because beforehand, we do not know how many access policies there will be in core. We know that we have user 1, we know that we have user roles, and by the way, because they're services, you can turn them off. As of Drupal 10.3, you can turn off the super user access policy so that user 1 no longer has an all access pass. I'm really proud of that one because I absolutely hated that fact. But you don't know what people will add to it, whether they will have this office hours policy or whether they will have another policy, or yeah, we don't need the screen anymore. So you don't know. You simply don't know. So this is where the variation cache shines, because we know that initially it varied by user.isSuperUser and user.roles. But now we might have an extra one, or 2 extra ones, or 3 extra ones. So we use all of that, and we take that to the variation cache. And because of these cache redirects, and because of this self-healing, that works. That works. This is the power of the variation cache. You don't know beforehand what you're going to be caching. You don't know where you're going to be caching it eventually. You don't know the cache ID. But the variation cache takes care of all of that for you. And if you happen to start out with something really specific, and then the next item that needs to go in the cache is very dumbed down, it's still going to be smart enough to break these paths, to recreate them, and to figure out how to find all of the possible outcomes. And with the access policy API, without variation cache, it wouldn't have been possible. But with variation cache, the access policy API became possible. And now, starting from Drupal 10.3, you can have some really crazy access policies on your website. And because they affect the set of permissions that you're getting, it means that it works everywhere. If you had a route access check which did a permission check. If you had an entity attribute check, which also like can edit own nodes, that's a permission that you would check alongside the author of the node, whether they're the same as the current user. All of these checks all over core, they all work immediately with your access policy, because we now have a cache that is capable of storing that highly variable data without you having to worry about it. That wouldn't have been possible. So that's a really good question, actually. And I can show you one of these access policies. That's actually something that I'm hoping to demo at DrupalCon Barcelona later this year. I'm hoping that that session gets accepted, because there I want to do a full deep dive into the access policy API. Well, not a deep dive, just generic awareness and how to use it. So let's say user roles cache context. No, not cache context. User roles access policy. So this is what that looks like. Is that big enough, by the way? Can everyone read that? A tiny bit bigger? Yeah, okay, for the people in the back. So commands and plus. Nope. Window, zoom. No, that's not. Oh my God, I'm an idiot. Sorry? Pinch out? Ooh. Yeah, see, I don't know how to use computers. I just know how to write code. Okay, so what does that look like? So we have the one that gets your permissions from your user roles. So let me get a little closer so I can use the pointer. Fun tool. So what does that look like? Well, first of all, we call the parent, and the parent gets your refinable cache, calculated permissions, it's called. But it's essentially another value object that uses the refinable cacheable dependency trait, as I told you to use. Then we look for your user roles, and then for each user role, we're going to create a calculated permissions item which contains the permissions of that user role and whether or not the user role is an admin role. Because if it's an admin role, we can just get rid of these and just promote that to the full thing where we just say you're an admin, so you have full access. So it's going to do that, and it's going to add the cacheable dependency of that user role. And that's all there is. So we have this value object now, which contains all of your permissions. But as you can see, we get the persistent cache context also, because this is what we're gathering from all access policies to go to the variation cache. So when you introduce a new access policy into your system, you need to rebuild the cache, because we no longer have that same initial state that we used to store all of your permission sets. You've introduced a new policy, so you need to flush that cache. And we have the same for the super user. So let's bring that one up. And I mean, how lovely is this? This is like, I'm super proud of this one. And then we have the super user, which I really hate, but we can turn off. And again, let me pinch. There we go. No, it's stop. Okay. There we go. Look at this one. It's even simpler. So again, we ask the base class to give us our value object so that you don't have to. And we just check whether you're user ID 1. And if you're not user ID 1, we return your value object. Nothing happens. But if you are user ID 1, then we're going to add an item with an empty permission set and your isAdmin flag set to true. That's all you need to do. And then obviously your persistent cache context here would be user.isSuperUser. This is going to go away one day. Right now you can already turn it off. It's my mission to get this out of core. I had to put it in there to be able to get it out of there, if that makes sense. So yeah, this is really cool. All very small classes. Group relies heavily on this. In group, you have 3 different scopes. So you can, again, this is something for a different session, but you can have scopes with this. Like the default scope is the Drupal scope, and you don't see that here because it's the default. So you don't have to fill that in. But group uses multiple scopes. And then across these scopes, we have multiple access policies. All of that works because of the VariationCache. So yeah, I started out in Amsterdam, DrupalCon Amsterdam in 2019, saying, hey, we should probably do something about our caching. It's now DrupalCamp 2024, and since last year, that, hey, we should do something about our caching is an official API in core. Yeah, 10 minutes left, but I'm just rambling. Anyone else have any questions? Because I think I quite covered your question in detail now. So
absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, so if you're going to do the time one, you'd do just a class like this,
Yes.
but calculate the permissions and check the time of day and add the cache context
Yes.
there for
Yeah.
the time.
And not only can
And
you
then you
add,
can stop people from using the site.
yeah, and you can also subtract. So your initial phase is the build phase where you build things, but then you have another alter phase, which isn't shown here because we're not using it here, where you can actually deny things. Again, I could go into detail if that session gets accepted in Barcelona, if people in the room are lucky enough to be there. But yeah, you can even subtract from it. And again, that won't work because it's powered by the variation cache. You can do whatever you want as long as you properly add cache context in there. Oh, and one final thing, because of cache redirects, because the clever people in the room may have figured out that, hey, if you have to specify all of these cache contexts beforehand, there. So if you have to specify all of these beforehand, you're just going to end up with a bunch of initial variability and no final cacheability that differs. Very good point. However, in your calculation here, you could go more granular, like you would sometimes see in a render array. Oh, not with the super user one, but with the roles one, for instance. Oh, but if you have this role, we're going to also check whether you have two-factor authentication enabled. And you're only going to get those permissions if you have two-factor authentication enabled. So now, most of that access policy would vary by user roles, but some of the values would have a redirect checking for that flag on your accounts. Do you have two-factor authentication? So redirects still work in here. It's just mainly not used because this is an optimization that we have in core, because every cache redirect is another cache hit. And we want to avoid those as much as possible. But they are there to make it work in case you do need them. Cool. Anyone else? Yep, over there.
Thank you. If you want to put the cache not in the database, but in the memory, do you need another service like Redis, or is it by
Nope.
default?
Nope. It works with any cache backend. As I said closer to the start, it wraps around a cache backend. So if you're working with purely like the memory on your server, you would use a memory cache, which is a cache backend supported by core. If you want to use Redis, same thing. If you want to use any type of caching infrastructure in Drupal, you have to create a backend that can, use that backend. A backend that can use that technology, and then you can start using it in Drupal. As soon as you have that, you can use it with the variation cache. So if you want to use Redis, and there is a module that allows you to use Redis caches, that's all you need. You can instantly start using those caches in the variation cache. It's not a cache. It's a wrapper around the cache. So it works with everything. That screen is getting really funky. Sorry about that. Anyone else? No. OK, then I'm going to turn on the screen one final time, just so that people at the office won't shoot me that I didn't show all of my slides. Where is it? You can see this. Speaker view is paused. Go away. There. I have so many tabs open. One of them will be my presentation. No, it's not. Whatever. I had a thank you slide in there. So thank you.